Sometimes the most profound moments of human connection come from the most heartbreaking circumstances. When single father Edmar Fowler discovered a 4-year-old girl abandoned in the freezing rain outside a Portland grocery store, he thought he was simply helping a lost child find her way back to worried parents. The tiny figure huddled behind a dumpster, soaked through her thin pajamas, clutching a torn stuffed elephant that had seen better days. She looked like any other frightened toddler who needed warmth and safety. But when little Hazel whispered 6 words about her parents that made this battle-hardened construction worker break down in tears, neither of them could have imagined that those whispered words would lead to the most shocking discovery of both their lives. What Edmar didn't know was that Hazel's mother was Dr. Vivian Sterling, one of America's most renowned pediatric surgeons and the director of the Sterling Children's Medical Foundation, a woman whose groundbreaking work had saved thousands of children's lives, whose face graced medical journals and humanitarian award ceremonies, and whose personal wealth could have provided Hazel with every luxury imaginable. Yet here was her daughter, abandoned in the rain, speaking words that would reveal a truth so devastating it would shake the very foundations of everything the medical community thought they knew about their celebrated hero. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn construction boots that Edmar wore had walked through countless job sites over the past 8 years, ever since he'd become a single father to his own son, Tommy, after his wife left them for what she called a better life. At 34, Edmar had learned to navigate the challenges of raising a child alone while working grueling hours to keep their small apartment in the Riverside district. His calloused hands, permanently stained with concrete dust and paint, told the story of a man who built his life one honest day's work at a time. Those same hands would soon hold a secret that could destroy one of the most powerful women in Portland's medical establishment. The freezing November rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning Portland streets into rivers and forcing most sensible people indoors. But Edmar had been working late at a renovation project downtown when he stopped at Morrison's Market for milk and bread, the kind of late-night grocery run that single parents knew all too well. The parking lot was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow through the persistent drizzle. He was hurrying toward his truck, collar turned up against the cold, when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the drumming of rain on pavement. A child's whimper, coming behind the large green dumpster near the store's loading dock. Edmar froze, his parental instincts immediately on high alert. He'd heard that sound before, 8 years ago when 3-year-old Tommy had gotten separated from him at the county fair. It was the particular cry of a very young child who was scared, cold, and completely alone. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten whoever was hiding there, his work boots splashing through puddles that reflected the neon signs of the shopping center. What he found behind that dumpster would haunt him for the rest of his life. A little girl, no more than 4 years old, sat curled in a ball against the concrete wall. Her blonde hair hung in wet strings around a face that was pale with cold and streaked with tears. She wore what had once been pink pajamas with unicorns on them, now soaked through and clinging to her tiny frame. Her feet were bare, blue with cold, and she clutched a stuffed elephant that was missing one ear and had stuffing coming out of several holes. But it was her eyes that stopped Edmar's heart, huge, frightened, and far too knowing for someone so young. "Hey there, sweetheart," Edmar said softly, kneeling down despite the dirty water soaking through his jeans. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The little girl looked up at him with those enormous eyes and for a moment didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said 6 words that would change everything. "Mommy and Daddy don't want me." The simple, devastating statement hit Edmar like a physical blow. He'd heard children say many things over the years, complaints about bedtimes, requests for candy, excited chatter about cartoons, but nothing had ever carried the weight of absolute truth that those 6 words contained. This wasn't the confusion of a temporarily lost child or the dramatic pronouncement of a youngster having a tantrum. This was a 4-year-old stating a fact about her reality with the kind of calm certainty that only comes from lived experience. "Oh, honey," Edmar whispered, his voice cracking despite his efforts to stay strong. "That can't be true." Every little girl is wanted by someone." But even as he said the words, he was taking in details that told a different story. The pajamas, while clearly expensive, showed signs of having been worn for days. The stuffed elephant bore the unmistakable marks of being a comfort object for a child who had faced many nights alone. Most telling of all were the little girl's remarkably clean hands and fingernails, suggesting she hadn't been on the streets long, but the hollow look in her eyes spoke of abandonment that went much deeper than one night in the rain. Edmar shrugged off his heavy work jacket and wrapped it around the shivering child, lifting her gently into his arms. She didn't resist, instead curling against his chest with the desperate trust of someone who had been waiting for any adult to show her kindness. The warmth of his body began to thaw her frozen fingers, and gradually she began to speak in fragments that would lead them both toward a truth neither was prepared to face. "My name is Hazel," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm 4 3/4. Mommy is very important and helps sick children, but she doesn't help me when I'm scared. Daddy lives far away and sends money but never comes to see me. The lady who watches me said I was too much trouble and left me here because nobody else wants a broken little girl." Each word was like a knife to Edmar's heart, painting a picture of neglect and abandonment that no child should ever experience. But it was that phrase, "broken little girl," that made him understand this wasn't just about parents who were temporarily unavailable or caregivers who had made a mistake. This was about a child who had been systematically rejected by the adults who were supposed to love and protect her. As he carried Hazel toward his truck, her small voice continued to reveal details that would soon lead to the most shocking revelation of his life. She spoke of a big house where she lived mostly alone, of a mother who was always at the hospital saving other children, and of photographs in medical magazines that showed her mommy receiving awards for helping families just like theirs. She described a world of privilege and recognition that existed parallel to her own experience of profound loneliness and neglect. Before we continue with this incredible story of how one man's act of kindness exposed the dark truth behind a medical hero's public image, tell us in the comments about a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness during your darkest moment. And if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow we have something truly special that will restore your faith in the power of ordinary people to change extraordinary lives. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens when Edmar discovers exactly who Hazel's mother really is, and how 6 whispered words from a 4-year-old would bring down one of the most respected figures in pediatric medicine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first priority was getting Hazel somewhere warm and dry. Edmar's truck cab felt like a sanctuary compared to the relentless November rain that continued to pound Portland streets. He cranked up the heater to full blast and adjusted the vents to blow directly on the shivering child, who had curled herself into the smallest possible ball in the passenger seat, still clutching her damaged stuffed elephant. "Let's get you warmed up, sweetheart," Edmar said softly, reaching behind his seat for the emergency blanket he kept there. It wasn't much, a thin thermal blanket from a camping store, but it was dry and would help retain her body heat. As he wrapped it around her tiny shoulders, he noticed details that made his heart ache even more deeply. The pajamas she wore weren't just expensive, they were designer. The fabric was high-quality cotton with intricate embroidery work around the collar and cuffs, the kind of sleepwear that would cost more than Edmar typically spent on Tommy's entire wardrobe for a season. But the unicorn pattern was faded from repeated washing, and there were small stains that suggested these had been her regular sleepwear for quite some time. Most telling were the careful repairs someone had made to small tears, hand-stitched patches that spoke of a child who took care of her few belongings because she understood their value. Her feet were what broke Edmar's heart the most. Small, pale, and blue with cold, they showed signs of having walked on rough pavement for some time. There were small cuts on her heels and dirt embedded in the creases of her toes,
evidence that she had been wandering barefoot for longer than just the few hours since sunset. Someone had painted her tiny toenails with bright pink polish weeks ago, but most of it had chipped away, leaving only small fragments that somehow made her current state seem even more tragic.
Hazel, Edmar said gently, using the name she had whispered to him behind the dumpster. Can you tell me how long you've been out here by yourself? The little girl looked up at him with those enormous eyes that seemed to hold far too much knowledge for someone so young. She considered the question with the careful thoughtfulness of a child who had learned that her words mattered, that adults might use what she said in ways she couldn't predict. Since the morning, she said finally, her voice still barely above a whisper. Mrs. Calloway said she couldn't watch me anymore because I was too much work and Mommy never paid her enough. She drove me here and said someone would come get me, but nobody came. The casual way Hazel recounted this abandonment was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her story. There was no dramatic crying or emotional outburst, just the matter-of-fact recounting of events by a child who had apparently learned not to expect better treatment from the adults in her life. Edmar felt a rage building in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the day Rebecca had walked out on Tommy, but he kept his voice calm and reassuring. Mrs. Calloway was wrong to leave you here, honey. Adults are supposed to take care of children, not abandon them. You didn't do anything wrong. Hazel studied his face with an intensity that was unnerving in someone so young. Are you going to leave me somewhere too? She asked, and the question contained such resignation that Edmar had to take a deep breath before responding. No, sweetheart. I'm going to make sure you're safe. We're going to figure this out together, okay? The promise seemed to unlock something in Hazel, and for the first time since he'd found her, she began to speak more freely. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and puzzling, filled with details that didn't quite add up to a coherent picture of her life or circumstances. She lived in a big house in the West Hills, Portland's most exclusive neighborhood, where she spent most of her time alone with various caretakers who came and went with increasing frequency. Her mother was a doctor who helped sick children, traveling frequently for important meetings and conferences. Hazel could recite her mother's schedule with the precision of a personal assistant, which hospital she would be at on which days, what time she typically came home, if she came home at all, and which conferences kept her away for weeks at a time. Mommy saves other children, she explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone repeating information she had heard many times. She's very important and very busy. Mrs. Calloway said Mommy cares more about sick children than healthy ones, and that's why she doesn't have time for me. The casual cruelty of that statement, delivered by a caregiver to a 4-year-old, made Edmar's hands tighten on the steering wheel. He was beginning to understand that Hazel's abandonment wasn't a single traumatic event, but rather the culmination of years of emotional neglect disguised as parental dedication to a noble cause. What about your daddy? Edmar asked gently. Does he live with you and your mommy? Hazel Heckerhex. Hazel shook her head, her blonde hair still damp and stringy from the rain. Daddy lives far away and sends money, but never visits. Mommy says he's too busy building his new life to worry about his old one. I have pictures of him, but they're old pictures from when I was a baby. As they sat in the warm truck cab, the heater gradually chasing away the chill from Hazel's small body, Edmar found himself trying to piece together the puzzle of this child's life. The expensive pajamas, the exclusive neighborhood, the mother who was apparently a prominent physician, all of these details suggested wealth and privilege, but the reality of Hazel's daily existence painted a picture of profound neglect and emotional abandonment that no amount of money could justify. Are you hungry, sweetheart? Edmar asked, suddenly realizing that a 4-year-old who had been on her own since morning had probably not eaten anything substantial. Hazel nodded eagerly, and for the first time she looked like a normal child responding to a basic need, rather than a tiny adult recounting the failures of the grown-ups around her. I'm very hungry. Mrs. Calloway didn't give me breakfast because she said she wasn't getting paid to feed me anymore. The casual cruelty continued to astound Edmar. He made a mental note to find out who this Mrs. Calloway was and ensure that appropriate authorities knew about her actions.
Abandoning a 4-year-old child was not just morally reprehensible, it was criminal. "Well, let's get some food in you then," Edmar said, putting the truck in gear. "I know a place that makes the best hot chocolate in Portland, and they serve food too." As they drove through the rain-soaked streets toward Millie's Diner, a 24-hour restaurant that Edmar and Tommy frequented when they wanted a special treat, Hazel began to relax slightly. The warmth of the truck, the promise of food, and perhaps most importantly, the presence of an adult who spoke to her with kindness and respect were working their magic on her small, traumatized psyche. "Mr. Edmar?" she said quietly as they pulled into the diner's parking lot. "Just Edmar is fine, honey. What is it?" "Why are you helping me?" "Mrs. Calloway said strangers don't help children unless they want something bad." The question hit Edmar like a physical blow, revealing yet another layer of the psychological damage this child had endured. Someone had taught a 4-year-old to distrust kindness, to assume that help came with dangerous strings attached. He turned off the engine and turned to face her fully, wanting to make sure she could see his sincerity. "Hazel, I'm helping you because it's the right thing to do. When we see someone who needs help, especially a child, we help them. That's what good people do. I have a son who's not much older than you, and I would hope that if he ever needed help, someone would be kind to him the way I'm trying to be kind to you." She studied his face with that unsettling intensity again, as if she were trying to determine whether his words could be trusted. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Your son is lucky," she said simply. "He has a daddy who stays." The words were delivered without self-pity or dramatic emphasis, but they carried the weight of a child's profound understanding of what she had been denied. As Edmar helped her down from the truck and into the diner, he found himself making another silent promise, not just to keep her safe for the moment, but to make sure she understood that she deserved better than the treatment she had received from the adults who were supposed to love and protect her. What neither of them could have anticipated was that the next few hours would reveal a truth so shocking that it would force them both to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the relationship between public virtue and private character, between professional success and personal responsibility. Millie's Diner occupied a corner spot on Sandy Boulevard that had been serving Portland's working class for over 40 years. The red vinyl booths were cracked with age, the linoleum floors bore the scuff marks of countless work boots, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. But the food was honest, the portions were generous, and the staff treated everyone with the kind of no-nonsense kindness that Edmar had come to value above all the trendy establishments that charged 3 times as much for half the warmth. At nearly 10 p.m., the diner was mostly empty except for a few night shift workers grabbing late dinners and an elderly man nursing a cup of coffee while reading a paperback novel. The bell above the door chimed as Edmar entered, carrying Hazel wrapped in his emergency blanket like a small, precious bundle. Her blonde hair had begun to dry in the truck's heat, revealing natural waves that framed her pale face, and her enormous eyes took in every detail of their surroundings with the alertness of someone who had learned early to assess new environments for potential threats. "Well, look what the rain washed in," called Betty Martinez from behind the counter. At 55, Betty had been working at Millie's for more than half her life, and she possessed the particular combination of maternal warmth and street-smart toughness that made her equally capable of comforting a crying child or ejecting an unruly drunk. She had known Edmar and Tommy since they started coming to the diner 3 years ago, and her sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation with the instincts of someone who had seen every variation of human drama play out in vinyl booths. "Hey, Betty," Edmar said, settling Hazel into a corner booth where she would feel secure and protected. "We need some hot chocolate and maybe some of that vegetable soup if you've got it. This little one has had a rough night." Betty approached their table with a pot of coffee for Edmar and a gentle smile for Hazel. She had raised 4 children of her own and currently helped care for 6 grandchildren, giving her an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional state of any child within a 50-foot radius. What she saw in Hazel's face made her expression tighten with concern. "Well, aren't you a beautiful little girl?" Betty said warmly, crouching down to Hazel's eye level. "I'm Betty, and this is my restaurant. What's your name, sweetheart?" "Hazel," came the whispered response, followed by a more formal introduction that broke both adults' hearts. I'm 4 3/4 years old, and I don't have anywhere to live right now because the grown-ups who were supposed to take care of me decided I was too much trouble."
The matter-of-fact delivery of this devastating information prompted Betty to exchange a meaningful look with Edmar. In her decades of serving late-night customers, she had encountered runaways, neglected children, and families in crisis. But something about Hazel's articulate explanation of her abandonment suggested a level of systematic neglect that went beyond temporary family problems. "Well, Hazel," Betty said with forced brightness, "you're safe here with Edmar and we. Let me get you that hot chocolate and some warm food, and we'll figure out what comes next. Does that sound good?" While Betty bustled away to prepare their order, Edmar found himself studying Hazel more carefully in the diner's fluorescent lighting. The expensive pajamas, the careful way she positioned herself in the booth to have a clear view of both the entrance and the back exit, the methodical way she arranged the salt and pepper shakers in a precise line. All of these details painted a picture of a child who had developed sophisticated coping mechanisms for an unstable and unpredictable environment. "Hazel," Edmar said gently, "can you tell me your mommy's full name? I want to make sure we can get in touch with her so she knows you're safe." The little girl's expression grew cautious again, as if she were weighing the potential consequences of providing this information. "Her name's Dr. Vivian Sterling," she said finally. "She works at lots of different hospitals, but mostly at Portland Children's Medical Center. People say she's very famous for helping sick children, but she's never home to help me when I get scared at night." The name hit Edmar like a physical blow. Dr. Vivian Sterling wasn't just any pediatric surgeon. She was arguably the most prominent medical figure in the Pacific Northwest. Her face regularly appeared on the covers of medical journals, and her Sterling Children's Medical Foundation had raised millions of dollars for pediatric research and treatment. Just last month, Tommy had done a school report on local heroes, and Dr. Sterling had been featured prominently in his presentation as an example of how one person's dedication could save thousands of lives. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could a woman who dedicated her life to healing children allow her own daughter to be abandoned behind a grocery store dumpster? How could someone who was celebrated for her compassion and dedication to pediatric welfare fail so completely to provide basic care and attention to her own 4-year-old child? "Dr. Sterling is your mommy?" Edmar asked carefully, trying to keep the shock out of his voice. Hazel nodded solemnly. "She's very important. Everyone always tells me how lucky I am to have such a special mommy who helps so many children. But I don't feel lucky. I feel like maybe if I was sick, she would want to spend time with me too." The profound sadness in that statement, a 4-year-old wishing she could be ill so her mother would pay attention to her, crystallized everything that was wrong with this situation. Betty returned with a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows and a bowl of hearty vegetable soup. But Edmar barely noticed the food. His mind was racing through the implications of what he had just learned. As Hazel wrapped her small hands around the warm mug and took careful sips of the hot chocolate, she began to relax enough to share more details about her life. The picture that emerged was one of systematic emotional neglect disguised as noble professional dedication. Dr. Sterling traveled constantly for conferences, research projects, and speaking engagements. When she was in Portland, she worked 14-hour days at the hospital, arriving before Hazel woke up and returning long after she had gone to bed. Hazel's care had been delegated to a series of nannies and babysitters, most of whom only lasted a few months before quitting due to lack of payment, impossible schedules, or simple frustration with being expected to raise a child whose mother was never available for consultation or decision-making. Mrs. Calloway was the most recent in this revolving door of caregivers, and according to Hazel, she'd grown increasingly resentful about being asked to work without reliable compensation. Mrs. Calloway said Mommy cared more about her reputation than her responsibilities. She said sick children made good newspaper stories, but healthy children just made noise and mess. The cruelty of exposing a 4-year-old to such adult cynicism was breathtaking, But it also revealed something important about the environment Hazel had been living in. The people hired to care for her had apparently felt free to voice their criticisms of Dr. Sterling's parenting priorities, creating an atmosphere where a small child was made to feel responsible for her mother's professional choices. As the evening progressed, Edmar found himself facing a moral dilemma that went beyond the simple good deed he had intended when he stopped to help what he thought was a lost child. Hazel wasn't lost. She had been deliberately abandoned by adults who were supposed to protect her. Her mother wasn't frantically searching for her missing daughter. According to Hazel, Dr. Sterling was currently at a medical conference in Chicago and wouldn't be back for 3 days. "What happens when your mommy comes home and you're not there?" Edmar asked gently. Hazel shrugged with the resignation of someone who had learned not to expect much attention from the adults in her life. "She probably won't notice for a while. Mrs. Calloway usually handles everything, and Mommy doesn't check on me unless Mrs. Calloway tells her there's a problem. And now Mrs. Calloway is gone, so there's nobody to tell her anything."
The casual way Hazel described this neglect was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. This wasn't a child experiencing temporary abandonment due to an emergency or family crisis. This was a little girl who had been systematically conditioned to expect minimal attention from her primary caregiver. Betty, who had been listening to this conversation while pretending to clean tables nearby, finally approached their booth with the directness that characterized all her interactions. "Edmar," she said quietly, "I think you need to call Child Protective Services. This little girl has been abandoned, and what she's describing sounds like ongoing neglect. Famous doctor or not, this isn't right." Edmar knew Betty was correct, but he also understood that involving CPS would mean Hazel would likely be placed in emergency foster care while the system tried to sort out the complexities of her situation. The thought of this traumatized child being passed to yet another set of strangers, sleeping in yet another unfamiliar bed, felt like adding more trauma to an already devastating situation. "What if we try to contact Dr. Sterling first?" Edmar suggested. "Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding, or maybe she doesn't realize what's been happening." Even as he said the words, Edmar didn't really believe them. A mother who was truly concerned about her child's welfare wouldn't have allowed the situation to deteriorate to the point where caregivers felt free to abandon a 4-year-old behind a grocery store. But he wanted to give Dr. Sterling the opportunity to explain herself before involving the authorities, partly out of fairness and partly because he couldn't quite reconcile the celebrated humanitarian he had read about with the neglectful parent Hazel was describing. What he couldn't have anticipated was that his decision to contact Dr. Sterling directly would set in motion a chain of events that would expose the dark truth behind one of Portland's most celebrated medical careers and force both him and Hazel to confront questions about the relationship between public virtue and private responsibility that neither of them was prepared to answer. The decision to contact Dr. Sterling directly proved more complicated than Edmar had anticipated. According to the Portland Children's Medical Center website, she was currently delivering the keynote address at the International Pediatric Surgery Conference in Chicago, scheduled to conclude her presentation at 11 p.m. Pacific Time. Her office voicemail message confirmed her absence and directed urgent matters to her colleague, Dr. James Patterson, who was covering her emergency cases. Edmar found himself staring at his phone in the diner's parking lot while Hazel slept peacefully in the truck's passenger seat, exhausted from the day's trauma and lulled by the warmth and security of having her immediate needs met. The little girl had eaten every drop of soup and finished her hot chocolate before curling up in the emergency blanket like a small, trusting animal that had finally found safety. The contrast between the sleeping child and the professional accolades scrolling across Dr. Sterling's biography on his phone screen created a cognitive dissonance that Edmar struggled to process. According to the medical center's website, Dr. Vivian Sterling had performed over 3,000 life-saving surgeries on children, pioneered innovative techniques for treating congenital heart defects, and raised over $50 million for pediatric research through her foundation. Her photograph showed a confident woman in her late 30s with intelligent eyes and the kind of composed expression that suggested someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure.
The accompanying article detailed her recent humanitarian mission to Guatemala, where she had spent 3 weeks providing free surgeries to children from impoverished families who had no access to advanced medical care. The piece quoted grateful parents who called her an angel sent from heaven and featured photographs of Dr. Sterling holding smiling children whose lives she had dramatically improved through her surgical expertise. How could this celebrated humanitarian be the same woman whose 4-year-old daughter had been abandoned behind a grocery store by a caregiver who claimed Dr. Sterling cared more about her reputation than her responsibilities? The disconnect was so profound that Edmar briefly wondered if there had been some mistake, if perhaps Hazel belonged to a different Dr. Sterling, or confused details in her traumatized state. But the little girl's precise recounting of her mother's schedule, her accurate description of the West Hills mansion where she lived, and her detailed knowledge of her mother's professional commitments eliminated any possibility of mistaken identity. This was definitely Dr. Vivian Sterling's daughter, and the evidence of systematic neglect was overwhelming. At 11:30 p.m., Edmar finally worked up the courage to call the emergency contact number listed for Dr. Sterling's foundation. The phone rang 4 times before connecting to a voicemail system that featured Dr. Sterling's own voice delivering a professionally warm message about the importance of the foundation's work and a promise to return calls within 24 hours. Dr. Sterling, Edmar began, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotions churning in his chest. My name is Edmar Fowler, and I'm calling about your daughter Hazel. She's safe and unharmed, but she was abandoned earlier today by someone named Mrs. Calloway and has been living on the streets. I found her behind a grocery store dumpster around 9 p.m., and she's currently with me. Please call me back as soon as you receive this message. He left his cell phone number and hung up, wondering if the call would be dismissed as a prank or if Dr. Sterling would recognize the gravity of the situation.
The wait that followed was excruciating. Edmar drove slowly through Portland's quiet late-night streets, unsure of his destination, but knowing he couldn't simply take Hazel home without some kind of plan. The responsible thing would be to drive directly to the nearest police station or emergency room and hand her over to the authorities who were trained to handle child abandonment cases. But every time he glanced at her peaceful face in the passenger seat, he found himself reluctant to wake her and thrust her into another bureaucratic system staffed by well-meaning strangers. His phone finally rang at 12:45 a.m., startling him from his worried thoughts. The caller ID showed only a number with a Chicago area code, but he answered immediately. This is Edmar Fowler. Mr. Fowler, this is Dr. Vivian Sterling. The voice was crisp, professional, and carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises efficiently. You called about my daughter. Is she injured? Has she been taken to a hospital? The questions revealed something important about Dr. Sterling's mindset. Her first concern was medical rather than emotional, focused on physical harm rather than the psychological trauma of abandonment. It was the response of someone who approached problems through a clinical lens, searching for symptoms to treat rather than underlying causes to address. She's not injured, Edmar replied carefully, but she's been abandoned and neglected. She was left behind a grocery store this morning by someone called Mrs. Calloway, who apparently told her that you don't pay caregivers and that you care more about sick children than healthy ones. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Dr. Sterling spoke again, her voice carried a note of defensive irritation that surprised Edmar with its coldness. Mrs. Calloway was terminated from her position due to reliability issues, Dr. Sterling said briskly. I'm sure Hazel is confused about the circumstances. Children often misunderstand adult conversations and situations. Where is my daughter now? The clinical detachment in her response was breathtaking. Her 4-year-old daughter had been abandoned on the streets for over 15 hours, and Dr. Sterling's primary concern seemed to be managing the narrative rather than addressing the child's welfare. She's with me, Edmar said, his voice hardening despite his efforts to remain diplomatic. She's safe and warm, but she's traumatized.
She told me that you're at a conference in Chicago and won't be back for 3 days. Is that correct? I'm delivering critical presentations on pediatric cardiac innovations that could save thousands of children's lives, Dr. Sterling replied, and Edmar could hear the barely controlled anger in her voice. My work has global implications that extend far beyond any temporary childcare disruption. I assume you're calling because you want money for taking care of Hazel temporarily. How much do you want? The question hit Edmar like a slap across the face. Dr. Sterling's immediate assumption that his concern for her daughter was financially motivated revealed everything he needed to know about how she viewed human relationships and moral obligations. I don't want your money, Edmar said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of disappointment that seemed to travel clearly across the phone connection. I want to understand how a woman who dedicates her life to saving children can allow her own daughter to be abandoned and neglected. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Dr. Sterling finally spoke, her voice had shifted from clinical detachment to barely controlled fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said sharply. "I have saved more children's lives than most people could count. I have dedicated every waking moment to advancing pediatric medicine and improving outcomes for the most vulnerable patients. The work I do matters on a scale that someone like you could never comprehend." "Someone like me?" Edmar repeated, his own anger beginning to surface. "Someone who stops to help abandoned children instead of stepping over them to get to the next career opportunity?" "Don't lecture me about moral obligations," Dr. Sterling snapped. "I have moral obligations to thousands of children whose lives depend on my research and surgical innovations. I can't allow myself to be distracted by temporary domestic inconveniences." The phrase "temporary domestic inconveniences" to describe her daughter's abandonment was so callous that Edmar felt physically sick. This wasn't a mother experiencing a momentary lapse of judgment or struggling with competing demands. This was someone who had fundamentally redefined parental responsibility to exclude her own child's basic emotional needs. "Hazel is 4 years old," Edmar said slowly, as if speaking to someone who had forgotten a crucial piece of information. "She's your daughter, not a domestic inconvenience. She was abandoned behind a dumpster in freezing rain, and when I found her, she told me that her mommy and daddy don't want her. What kind of life have you created for this child that she believes nobody wants her?" "Hazel is provided with excellent housing, nutrition, educational opportunities, and medical care," Dr. Sterling replied stiffly. "She attends the finest private preschool in Portland and has access to resources that most children could only dream of. If temporary caregivers have proven unreliable, that's a staffing issue that can be resolved with better screening procedures." The reduction of her daughter's emotional trauma to a staffing issue crystallized everything that was fundamentally wrong with Dr. Sterling's approach to parenthood. She had apparently convinced herself that providing material resources was equivalent to providing love, attention, and emotional security. "Dr. Sterling," Edmar said carefully, "your daughter doesn't need better screening procedures for caregivers. She needs a mother who prioritizes her emotional well-being alongside her professional achievements. She needs someone who comes home at night, who reads her bedtime stories, who notices when she's scared or sad or lonely."
"I notice plenty," Dr. Sterling said coldly. "I notice that my work saves actual lives while people like you offer meaningless platitudes about emotional well-being. I notice that my research funding provides opportunities for medical breakthroughs that benefit children around the world. And I notice that you're keeping my daughter from me while presuming to judge choices you're completely unqualified to understand." The conversation was revealing Dr. Sterling's true character with devastating clarity. This wasn't a mother who had made mistakes or struggled with work-life balance. This was someone who had consciously chosen to prioritize professional recognition over parental responsibility and had constructed elaborate justifications for that choice. "I'm not keeping Hazel from you," Edmar said quietly.
I'm protecting her from further abandonment until you decide whether you actually want to be her mother or whether you prefer to continue treating her as a staffing problem that interferes with your career goals." The phone call ended with Dr. Sterling hanging up abruptly, leaving Edmar staring at his phone in the parking lot of an all-night convenience store while Hazel continued to sleep peacefully in the passenger seat. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears about the kind of environment this child had been living in, and it had revealed that her abandonment wasn't an unfortunate accident, but rather the predictable result of systematic emotional neglect. What Edmar couldn't have anticipated was that Dr. Sterling's next move would be to mobilize the full weight of her professional influence and financial resources to ensure that her temporary domestic inconvenience was resolved quickly and quietly, regardless of what that might mean for Hazel's long-term welfare. The aftermath of the phone call left Edmar sitting in the dark parking lot, staring at his cell phone while trying to process the full implications of what he had just experienced. Dr. Sterling's cold dismissal of her daughter's emotional needs wasn't just disappointing, it was genuinely shocking in its clinical detachment. The woman, celebrated for her compassion towards sick children, had displayed a level of indifference toward her own daughter's suffering that bordered on pathological. Hazel stirred in the passenger seat, her small face scrunching up as she transitioned from deep sleep to wakefulness. Even in her unconscious state, she maintained the alert posture of someone who had learned to remain vigilant against potential threats, her hand never releasing its grip on the tattered stuffed elephant that seemed to be her primary source of comfort. "Where are we?" she asked softly, her voice still thick with sleep but carrying the immediate awareness of someone accustomed to waking up in unfamiliar places. "We're safe," Edmar replied gently, turning in his seat to face her fully. "I just finished talking to your mommy on the phone. She knows you're okay." Hazel's expression didn't show the relief or excitement that most children would display upon learning their mother had been contacted. Instead, her face took on the resigned wariness of someone preparing for disappointment. "Is she coming to get me?" Hazel asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "She's still at her conference in Chicago," Edmar said carefully, watching the little girl's face for signs of distress. "She won't be back for a couple of days, but we're going to figure out what to do until then." Hazel nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that had characterized all her responses to adult failures. "She probably told you she's too important to come home early. She always says helping other children is more important than helping me, because I'm not sick." The casual way Hazel recounted her mother's priorities was heartbreaking, but it also revealed something crucial about the environment she had been living in. This wasn't a child making dramatic accusations in a moment of anger. This was someone accurately reporting conversations she had overheard many times. "Hazel," Edmar said gently, "what would make you feel safe right now? Where would you like to go?" The question seemed to surprise her. Apparently, no adult had ever asked for her input about decisions that affected her welfare. She considered the question with the seriousness of someone unaccustomed to having her preferences consulted. "Could I maybe stay with you and your son?" she asked hesitantly. "Just until Mommy decides what to do with me? I promise I wouldn't be any trouble. I'm very good at being quiet and staying out of the way." The phrase, "staying out of the way," broke Edmar's heart all over again. A 4-year-old child shouldn't have to develop strategies for making herself invisible to avoid burdening the adults responsible for her care. "You wouldn't be any trouble at all," Edmar assured her. "And you don't need to stay out of the way. Children are supposed to take up space and make noise and ask questions. That's what being a kid means."
For the first time since he had found her, Hazel's face showed genuine surprise. The concept that her presence might be welcomed rather than tolerated seemed to be completely foreign to her experience. "Really?" she asked, and the hope in her voice was almost too painful to bear. "I could ask questions and you wouldn't get angry?" "I would love to answer your questions," Edmar said sincerely. "My son Tommy loves to ask questions too. We could learn things together." The drive back to Edmar's apartment in the Riverside district took them through Portland's quiet late-night streets, past closed businesses and neighborhoods where most families were sleeping peacefully in their beds.
As they traveled, Hazel began to open up about her life in ways that revealed the profound isolation she had experienced despite living in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. She described days spent alone in her mother's mansion, entertaining herself with educational toys and books while a series of caregivers sat in the kitchen, using their phones or watching television. She talked about elaborate dinners prepared by a housekeeper that she ate by herself at a formal dining table, setting her stuffed elephant in the chair beside her for company. Most devastating of all, she recounted bedtime routines where she read herself stories and sang herself lullabies because there was never anyone available to provide the comfort and connection that children need to feel secure. "Do you and Tommy eat dinner together?" Hazel asked, as they pulled into the apartment complex parking lot. "Every night," Edmar confirmed. "We sit at our little kitchen table and talk about our days. Tommy tells me about school and his friends, and I tell him about my work projects. Sometimes we plan weekend adventures or discuss books we're reading." The simple description of their daily routine seemed to fascinate Hazel, as if Edmar were describing exotic customs from a foreign culture. The idea that parents and children might actually enjoy spending time together, that families could share meals and conversation as a matter of course rather than as special occasions, was apparently revolutionary to her understanding of how households functioned. "What if Tommy doesn't want me to stay?" Hazel asked, as they climbed the stairs to Edmar's second-floor apartment. "What if he thinks I'm weird or annoying?" "Tommy is gonna love having you here," Edmar said confidently. "He's always wanted a little sister, and he's very good at taking care of people who need help." The apartment that greeted them was modest but warm, filled with the comfortable clutter of a life built around genuine affection rather than material display. Tommy's artwork covered the refrigerator, board games were stacked on shelves beside well-worn books, and family photographs captured moments of joy and connection that spoke to the deep bond between father and son. Tommy emerged from his bedroom in pajamas and slippers, rubbing sleep from his eyes, but immediately alert when he saw Hazel. At 11, he possessed the emotional intelligence that came from being raised by a father who prioritized character development over academic achievement or material success. "Dad?" Tommy said quietly, taking in the scene of his father arriving home after midnight with a small child wrapped in an emergency blanket. "Is everything okay?" "Tommy, I want you to meet Hazel. She's going to stay with us for a few days while we figure out how to help her family. She's had a really hard day, and she needs some kindness and patience while she feels safe again." Tommy approached Hazel with the careful consideration of someone who understood that traumatized people needed space and time to trust. He didn't overwhelm her with questions or attempt to force interaction, instead simply sitting cross-legged on the living room floor and speaking in the gentle tone his father had taught him to use with anyone who seemed scared or confused. "Hi, Hazel," Tommy said softly. "I'm really glad you're here. Do you want to see my room? I have some books about animals that are pretty cool, and I can make up the couch bed for you if you want to sleep in the living room where you can see everything." The sensitivity of Tommy's offer, recognizing that Hazel might feel more secure in a space where she could monitor her environment, revealed the depth of emotional wisdom that Edmar had cultivated in his son through years of patient modeling and teaching. For the first time since Edmar had found her, Hazel smiled. It was a small, tentative expression, but it transformed her face completely, revealing the beautiful, intelligent child who had been hidden beneath layers of fear and resignation. "I would like that very much," Hazel said formally. "Thank you for sharing your home with me, Tommy. I promise I'll be very good and won't cause any problems." "You don't have to be perfect," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "Nobody in our family is perfect. We just try to be kind to each other and help when someone needs it." As Edmar watched his son effortlessly welcome this traumatized child into their home, he felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with academic achievements or athletic accomplishments. Tommy was demonstrating the values that truly mattered: compassion, generosity, and the instinctive understanding that family wasn't defined by blood relationships, but by mutual care and commitment. The next hour was spent in the gentle, domestic routines that would become familiar to Hazel over the following days. Tommy showed her where the bathroom was and how the shower worked, demonstrating the child safety locks that Edmar had never removed, despite Tommy's protests that he was too old for such precautions. Edmar prepared the fold-out couch bed with fresh sheets and extra blankets, creating a cozy nest where Hazel could feel protected while still being part of the family's living space. Most importantly, they established the kind of bedtime routine that Hazel had apparently never experienced. Edmar read a story while both children listened, his voice carrying the warmth and patience that had comforted Tommy through years of nighttime fears and questions. Tommy contributed commentary and questions that helped draw Hazel into the narrative, teaching her through example that stories were meant to be shared experiences rather than solitary entertainment. "Will you be here when I wake up?" Hazel asked as Edmar tucked the blankets around her small form. "I'll be here," Edmar promised, "and if you get scared during the night, you can wake me up. My room is right down the hall, and Tommy's room is right next to yours. You're not alone anymore." The simple assurance that she wouldn't be abandoned during the night brought tears to Hazel's eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief from someone who had finally found adults who understood that children needed consistent presence and protection. As Edmar turned off the lights and settled into his own bed, he found himself thinking about the contrast between the home he had created for Tommy and the emotionally barren environment that Dr. Sterling had provided for Hazel. Money couldn't buy the security that came from knowing you were valued and wanted. Professional achievement couldn't substitute for the daily acts of attention and care that made children feel safe in the world. What he couldn't have anticipated was that his decision to open his home to this abandoned child would soon attract the attention of powerful people who viewed his kindness as a threat to carefully constructed reputations and professional relationships that were worth millions of dollars. The morning brought a transformation in Hazel that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. She woke before dawn, sitting quietly on the fold-out bed while studying her new surroundings with the careful attention of someone memorizing details in case they suddenly disappeared. When Edmar emerged from his bedroom at 6 a.m. to begin his usual routine of preparing breakfast and packing Tommy's lunch, he found her sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, watching the sunrise paint the apartment walls with golden light. "Good morning, sweetheart," Edmar said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Did you sleep okay?" "I slept very well, thank you. I didn't want to wake anyone by moving around too much. I've been thinking about what I should do to help while I'm staying here." The fact that a 4-year-old was already worrying about earning her keep revealed the transactional nature of every relationship she had experienced. In Hazel's world, kindness came with expectations and obligations that had to be carefully managed to avoid disappointing the adults who temporarily tolerated her presence. "You don't need to do anything to help," Edmar assured her, beginning his morning coffee ritual. "You're our guest, and guests are supposed to be taken care of, not put to work. Your only job is to be a kid and let us worry about the grown-up stuff." This concept seemed genuinely foreign to Hazel, who watched with fascination as Edmar moved through the domestic routines that had become second nature after 8 years of single parenthood. The ease with which he prepared breakfast, sorted laundry, and tidied the living space while humming quietly under his breath painted a picture of someone who found satisfaction in the daily acts of maintaining a home and caring for his family. Tommy emerged from his bedroom already dressed for school, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his hair still bearing the imprint of his pillow. He greeted Hazel with the casual warmth of someone who had already accepted her as part of the household, asking if she wanted to help him feed the goldfish that lived in a small tank near the living room window. "His name is Einstein," Tommy explained as Hazel carefully measured out the fish food with the precision of a laboratory scientist. Dad got him for me when I was 7, and he's been my best friend ever since. Well, one of my best friends. Fish aren't great at conversation, but they're excellent listeners." The gentle humor in Tommy's explanation brought the first genuine giggle Edmar had heard from Hazel, a sound so pure and joyful that it seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the apartment. This was what childhood laughter was supposed to sound like: spontaneous, innocent, and free from the weight of adult concerns and calculations.
As the morning progressed, Edmar found himself marveling at how naturally Hazel fit into their established routines. She helped set the table with the careful attention to detail that characterized all her actions, asked thoughtful questions about Tommy's school projects, and listened with genuine interest as Edmar explained his plans for the day's construction work. Most remarkably, she seemed to be learning how families actually functioned, absorbing lessons about mutual respect, shared responsibility, and unconditional affection that had apparently been completely absent from her previous experience. The first sign of trouble came when Edmar's phone rang during breakfast. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. When he answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as Miss Patricia Henley from the Oregon Department of Human Services, Child Protective Services Division. "Mr. Fowler," Miss Henley said in the professionally neutral tone that social workers used when delivering potentially devastating news, "I received a report yesterday evening about a minor child in your care who may have been abandoned or neglected. I need to schedule a home visit to assess the situation and ensure the child's safety and welfare." Edmar felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications of the call. Someone had contacted CPS about Hazel's situation, which meant that the informal arrangement he had created was about to be subjected to official scrutiny that could result in her removal from the first stable environment she had experienced in years. "Of course," Edmar replied, carefully, aware that Hazel was listening to every word with the alertness of someone who had learned to monitor adult conversations for signs of impending changes to her living situation. "When would you like to schedule the visit?" "This afternoon would be preferable," Miss Henley said. "Given the nature of the allegations, we need to ensure that proper protocols are being followed and that the child is in an appropriate placement." The phrase, "appropriate placement," carried ominous implications that Edmar understood all too well. From CPS's perspective, a single father with limited financial resources was unlikely to be considered the optimal temporary guardian for a child from an affluent family, regardless of the quality of care he was providing or the emotional needs being met. After ending the call, Edmar sat quietly for a moment, trying to process the implications while maintaining a calm demeanor for the children's sake. Hazel had gone very still, her small hands gripping her fork with white knuckles as she stared at her plate of scrambled eggs. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked in a whisper that barely carried across the small kitchen table. "I don't know, sweetheart," Edmar replied, honestly, recognizing that Hazel deserved truth rather than false reassurances. "But I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay somewhere safe and with people who care about you." Tommy, who had been listening to the conversation with the serious attention he brought to all family discussions, reached across the table to gently touch Hazel's hand. "My dad doesn't make promises he can't keep," Tommy said firmly. "If he says he's going to help you, then he will. And even if the social worker people want to move you somewhere else, we'll make sure you know that you always have a family here who cares about you." The maturity and compassion in Tommy's response reminded Edmar of why he was so proud of the young man his son was becoming. Despite being only 11 years old, Tommy understood that love wasn't conditional on circumstances and that the bonds they had formed with Hazel over the past 18 hours represented real commitment rather than temporary charity. The hours leading up to the CPS visit were filled with a strange mixture of normal domestic routine and underlying tension. Edmar called his foreman to explain that he would need to leave work early for a family emergency,
a conversation that revealed the precarious nature of his employment situation. Missing work, even for legitimate reasons, meant lost wages that his tight budget could barely absorb. Hazel spent the morning observing the apartment with new intensity, as if she were memorizing details she might need to recall later. She helped Tommy with his weekend homework, demonstrating reading skills that were remarkably advanced for her age, and asked careful questions about the family photographs that decorated the living room walls. "Who is this lady with you and Tommy?" she asked, pointing to a framed picture that showed Edmar, Tommy, and a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "That's my mom," Tommy said gently. "She died when I was really little, but Dad says she's still part of our family because we remember her and try to live the way she would want us to." Hazel studied the photograph with intense concentration, as if she were trying to understand how families could maintain connections to people who were no longer physically present. "Do you miss her?" she asked with the directness that only children could manage. "Every day," Tommy replied honestly. "But missing someone isn't always sad. Sometimes it's like carrying a warm feeling in your heart that reminds you how much you were loved."
The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door that arrived precisely at 2 p.m. Miss Patricia Henley turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with graying hair, practical clothes, and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many situations where children suffered due to adult failures. She carried a briefcase and a tablet computer, tools of a profession that required extensive documentation of human suffering and systematic evaluation of family dysfunction. "Mr. Fowler," Miss Henley said as Edmar opened the door, "I'm Patricia Henley from DHS. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me on such short notice." The social worker's assessment of the apartment was thorough and professional, but Edmar could see her taking note of details that might be interpreted as evidence of inadequate resources: the modest furnishings, the small bedrooms, and the limited space for a growing family. All of these factors would be weighed against Hazel's apparent needs and compared to alternative placement options. "This is Hazel," Edmar said, introducing the little girl who had positioned herself close to Tommy for moral support. "And this is my son, Tommy." Miss Henley knelt down to Hazel's eye level with the practiced ease of someone who specialized in communicating with traumatized children. "Hello, Hazel," Miss Henley said gently. "I'm here to make sure you're safe and to understand what's been happening in your life. Can you tell me how you're feeling about staying here with Mr. Fowler and Tommy?" Hazel's response was delivered with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words might determine her immediate future. "I feel very safe here," she said clearly. "Edmar and Tommy have been kind to me, and they make sure I have food and a warm bed and stories before sleeping. They don't get angry when I ask questions, and they don't tell me I'm too much trouble." The social worker made notes on her tablet while asking follow-up questions that revealed her professional experience with abandoned and neglected children. Her inquiries were gentle but thorough, designed to assess both Hazel's physical welfare and her emotional state. "Hazel," Miss Henley said carefully, "can you tell me about your mommy and where you were living before you came here?" The question opened a floodgate of information that painted a devastating picture of systematic neglect disguised as professional dedication. Hazel described her mother's constant travel, the revolving door of caregivers, the lonely meals and bedtime routines, and finally the abandonment by Mrs. Calloway that had left her wandering the streets in freezing rain. Miss Henley's expression grew increasingly grim as she documented the details of Hazel's previous living situation. The contrast between the emotional poverty of the Sterling mansion and the warmth of Edmar's modest apartment was becoming impossible to ignore. "Mr. Fowler," Miss Henley said when her initial assessment was complete, "I need to be honest with you about the complications we're facing. Dr. Sterling has already contacted our department and her attorney. She's demanding immediate return of her daughter and has raised questions about your motivations for taking custody of Hazel without proper authorization."
The words hit Edmar like a physical blow, revealing that Dr. Sterling had chosen to weaponize the very system designed to protect children rather than addressing the fundamental issues that had led to her daughter's abandonment in the first place. The revelation that Dr. Sterling had already mobilized legal and bureaucratic forces against him sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with Portland's November weather. Miss Henley's tablet buzzed with an incoming message, and her expression grew increasingly troubled as she read the screen. "Mr. Fowler," she said carefully, "I've just received additional information that complicates this situation significantly. Dr. Sterling's attorney has filed paperwork questioning your background and fitness to care for a minor child from Dr. Sterling's socioeconomic background. There are also questions about your motivations for taking custody without proper authorization." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Edmar could feel Hazel's small hand slip into his, her fingers trembling with the intuitive understanding that the adults were discussing something that could separate her from the first real family she had ever known. "What exactly are they questioning about my background?" Edmar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Miss Henley consulted her tablet again, clearly uncomfortable with the information she was required to relay. "They've raised concerns about your financial stability, your single-parent status, and your qualifications to provide appropriate care for a minor from Dr. Sterling's socioeconomic background. There are also questions about your motivations for taking custody without proper authorization." The systematic attack on his character was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Dr. Sterling was using every advantage of class and professional status to portray his act of kindness as something potentially predatory or self-serving. The very qualities that made him a good father, his working-class background, his modest income, and his practical approach to child-rearing, were being weaponized against him.
"I found a 4-year-old child abandoned in the rain," Edmar said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone fighting to maintain composure in front of children. "I brought her somewhere safe and warm, fed her, and contacted her mother immediately. If that makes me unfit to care for children, then we need to seriously reconsider what fitness means." Tommy had moved closer to Hazel during this conversation, his 11-year-old mind clearly processing the implications of what was being discussed. When he spoke, his voice carried a maturity that would have been impressive in someone twice his age. "Miss Henley," Tommy said respectfully, "can I ask you something? When you look around our apartment, do you see anything that would hurt a child or make them feel unsafe?" The social worker's professional demeanor softened slightly as she considered the question. The apartment was modest, but meticulously maintained, filled with books and family photographs, and clearly organized around the comfort and well-being of its occupants. "No, Tommy," Miss Henley replied honestly. "I see a home where children are obviously loved and cared for." "And when you talk to Hazel," Tommy continued, with the persistence of someone who had learned to advocate for what was right, "does she seem scared of my dad or afraid that he might hurt her?" Miss Henley looked down at Hazel, who was still holding Edmar's hand while watching the adult conversation with the focused attention of someone's entire future hung in the balance. "No," Miss Henley admitted. "She seems remarkably comfortable and secure." "Then why does it matter how much money we have or what kind of job my dad does? Shouldn't the important thing be whether Hazel is safe and happy?" The question highlighted the fundamental absurdity of a system that would prioritize economic status over emotional welfare, that would remove a child from a loving environment simply because it didn't meet certain financial criteria. Miss Henley's expression suggested that she was grappling with the same contradiction. Before she could respond, her phone rang with a call that she answered with obvious reluctance. The conversation was brief but intense, conducted in the professional shorthand that social workers used when discussing cases with their supervisors. "Mr. Fowler," Miss Henley said when she ended the call, "I'm being directed to arrange for Hazel's immediate placement in emergency foster care pending resolution of the custody dispute.
Dr. Sterling's attorney has convinced my supervisor that keeping Hazel here represents a potential liability for the department." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Hazel's grip on Edmar's hand tightened to the point of pain, and Tommy made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Please don't take me away," Hazel whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of absolute desperation. "Sweetheart," Edmar said gently, kneeling down to her eye level, "this isn't about anything you did wrong. You have been absolutely perfect, and Tommy and I love having you here. This is about grown-up problems that have nothing to do with you." Miss Henley was clearly struggling with the ethical implications of her orders. Her professional training told her to follow departmental directives, but her experience and instincts were screaming that removing Hazel from this environment would cause more harm than good. "Mr. Fowler," she said carefully, "is there any family member who could take temporary custody while this situation is resolved, someone who might be considered a more conventional placement option?" The cruel irony of the situation was revealed. Edmar's sister lived across the country and barely made ends meet as a single mother herself. His parents had passed away years earlier, and he had no other close relatives who could provide care for Hazel. The very circumstances that had made him particularly sensitive to an abandoned child's needs, his experience as a single parent, his understanding of financial struggle, his hard-won wisdom about what children actually needed, also made him vulnerable to legal challenges from people with more resources and connections. "There's no one," Edmar said simply. "But Miss Henley, I need you to understand something. If you take Hazel away from here and put her with strangers, you're going to traumatize a child who has already been through more abandonment than anyone should experience in a lifetime. She's not a case file or a liability concern. She's a little girl who finally found somewhere she feels safe."
The social worker's internal conflict was evident in her expression. She was caught between bureaucratic pressure from above and the clear evidence of her own eyes about what was actually in Hazel's best interests. "I need to make some phone calls," Miss Henley said finally. "Mr. Fowler, I'm going to request a temporary delay in the removal order while I consult with my supervisor about the specifics of this case. But I need you to understand that Dr. Sterling has significant influence, and her attorney is pushing for immediate action." The brief reprieve felt like a stay of execution, but Edmar knew it was only temporary. Dr. Sterling wasn't just using her wealth and connections to reclaim her daughter. She was systematically destroying anyone who had witnessed her failures as a parent. By characterizing Edmar as potentially dangerous or opportunistic, she was transforming the narrative from one of parental neglect to one of stranger danger. While Miss Henley stepped outside to make her calls, the three of them sat together on the living room couch, trying to process the magnitude of what they were facing. Hazel had curled herself into Edmar's lap like a small animal seeking protection from predators, while Tommy sat close enough to maintain physical contact with both of them. "Dad," Tommy said quietly, "what if they take her away and put her with people who don't understand how scared she gets at night? What if they don't know that she needs her elephant to sleep, or that she's afraid of loud voices?" The questions revealed Tommy's intuitive understanding that Hazel's needs went far beyond basic food and shelter. She required the kind of patient, consistent care that could only come from people who genuinely cared about her emotional well-being, rather than viewing her as a professional obligation. "Then we'll have to trust that Miss Henley will make sure the foster family understands how to take care of her," Edmar said, though his voice lacked conviction. They all knew that the likelihood of finding emergency foster parents who could provide the specialized attention Hazel needed was virtually non-existent. "I don't want to go to strangers again," Hazel said in a voice so small it was barely audible. "I want to stay here, where people know my name and read me stories and
don't get angry when I ask about things." The simple statement encapsulated everything that was wrong with the system that was supposed to protect children like her. Hazel wasn't asking for luxury or special treatment. She was asking for the basic human connections that every child deserved. She wanted to be known, understood, and valued for who she was, rather than managed as a problem to be solved. Miss Henley returned from her phone calls with an expression that mixed relief with apprehension. "Mr. Fowler, I've managed to secure a 48-hour delay in the removal order, but there are conditions. You'll need to agree to daily check-ins with our department, and Hazel will need to undergo a psychological evaluation to assess any potential trauma from her experiences." The compromise felt like a small victory wrapped in ominous implications. The psychological evaluation could easily be manipulated to support whatever narrative Dr. Sterling's attorney wanted to construct, and the daily check-ins would create a paper trail that could be used to justify future interventions. But 48 hours also meant 48 hours more for Hazel to experience what it felt like to be part of a real family. 48 more hours for the truth about her abandonment to become clearer, and 48 more hours for someone to recognize that wealth and professional status weren't adequate substitutes for love and attention. "We'll take whatever time we can get," Edmar said firmly. "And we'll make sure that anyone who evaluates Hazel understands exactly what kind of environment she was living in before she came here." As the social worker packed up her materials and prepared to leave, she paused at the door with the expression of someone who wanted to say more than her professional role allowed. "Mr. Fowler, I've been doing this job for 15 years. And I've seen a lot of situations where children get caught between adult conflicts and competing interests. But I want you to know that what you've done for this little girl, the way you've cared for her and made her feel safe, that matters more than any legal paperwork or financial evaluation." The acknowledgement meant more to Edmar than any official commendation could have, coming from someone who had dedicated her career to protecting vulnerable children. But as the social worker's car disappeared down the street, he also understood that good intentions and moral clarity weren't always enough to overcome systemic inequalities and the raw power that came with wealth and professional influence. Dr. Sterling had 48 hours to mobilize every resource at her disposal to reclaim control of the narrative and eliminate the witnesses to her failures as a mother. And Edmar had 48 hours to somehow prove that love and dedication mattered more than money and status, that a 4-year-old child's emotional well-being was more important than protecting the reputation of one of Portland's most celebrated medical professionals.
The 48-hour reprieve passed with agonizing slowness, each hour bringing them closer to an uncertain future, while simultaneously providing precious additional time for Hazel to experience what stable family life actually felt like. Edmar had taken emergency leave from his construction job, a financial sacrifice that would impact their grocery budget for weeks, but seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of losing Hazel to a system that prioritized bureaucratic convenience over a child's emotional needs. On the morning of the second day, while Hazel and Tommy worked together on a puzzle depicting woodland animals, Edmar's phone rang with a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Sarah Chen from the Portland Police Bureau's Family Crimes Unit, and her words carried the weight of an investigation that had been quietly building momentum while Dr. Sterling mobilized her legal resources. "Mr. Fowler," Detective Chen said, with the professional courtesy that characterized all her interactions, "I understand you're currently caring for Hazel Sterling, and I wanted to speak with you about some information that has come to our attention regarding her abandonment and the circumstances surrounding her mother's care." The revelation that law enforcement was investigating the situation brought both hope and apprehension. While police involvement suggested that someone was taking Hazel's abandonment seriously as a potential crime, it also meant that the stakes were escalating beyond a simple custody dispute into territory where careers and reputations could be permanently destroyed. "I'd be happy to speak with you," Edmar replied carefully.
aware that Hazel was listening with the heightened alertness she always displayed when adults discussed her situation. "When would be convenient?" "Actually, I'm in your neighborhood now," Detective Chen said. "Would it be possible for me to stop by? I have some questions about Mrs. Calloway and the circumstances under which Hazel was abandoned, and I'd also like to speak with Hazel herself if she's comfortable with that." Within 20 minutes, Detective Chen was sitting in Edmar's living room, her presence both reassuring and intimidating. She was a woman in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing civilian clothes that suggested she understood the importance of not frightening children with official uniforms or intimidating symbols of authority. "Hazel," Detective Chen said gently, positioning herself at the little girl's eye level. "I'm Detective Chen, and I'm here because I want to make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to other children. Can you tell me about Mrs. Calloway and why she left you at the store?" What followed was a conversation that revealed the systematic nature of Hazel's neglect with devastating clarity. Detective Chen's questions were gentle but thorough, designed to extract information without traumatizing an already vulnerable child. Hazel's responses painted a picture of abandonment that went far beyond a single caregiver's momentary lapse in judgment. Mrs. Calloway had been working without pay for over 2 months, according to Hazel's recollections. Dr. Sterling's frequent travel and erratic schedule had made it impossible for caregivers to establish any kind of reliable routine or compensation structure. Most disturbing of all, Hazel revealed that Mrs. Calloway had received explicit instructions from Dr. Sterling to handle the situation when she called to complain about the unpaid wages and impossible working conditions. "Mommy told Mrs. Calloway that she was too busy with important work to deal with staffing problems," Hazel recounted, with the matter-of-fact delivery that had characterized all her descriptions of maternal neglect. "Mrs. Calloway said if Mommy didn't want to take care of me, then maybe I should find someone who did. She said Mommy would probably be happier if I just disappeared." The casual cruelty of exposing a 4-year-old to such adult cynicism was breathtaking. But it also revealed something crucial about Dr. Sterling's approach to parenting. She had apparently delegated not just the daily care of her daughter, but also the responsibility for solving the problems that arose when caregivers became frustrated with impossible working conditions. Detective Chen's expression grew increasingly grim as she documented Hazel's testimony. The evidence was pointing toward a pattern of willful neglect that could constitute criminal child endangerment, regardless of Dr. Sterling's professional status or charitable contributions. "Mr. Fowler," Detective Chen said when her interview with Hazel was complete, "I need you to know that we've also been investigating Mrs. Calloway's background and her relationship with Dr. Sterling. What we've discovered is quite troubling." The detective pulled out a folder containing documents that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the custody battle. Mrs. Calloway, it turned out, had been working without a valid childcare license for over a year. More damaging still, she had previously been reported to state authorities for neglecting children in her care, but those reports had somehow been buried or dismissed without proper investigation. Dr. Sterling hired Mrs. Calloway despite knowing about these previous incidents, the detective explained. "Our investigation suggests that she deliberately chose caregivers who wouldn't ask questions about her parenting practices or demand accountability for proper working conditions."
The implications were staggering. Dr. Sterling hadn't simply made poor childcare choices due to her busy schedule. She had systematically selected caregivers who were unlikely to report neglect or demand the kind of parental involvement that would interfere with her professional commitments. Tommy, who had been listening to the conversation with the focused attention he brought to all family discussions, raised his hand like he was in school asking a question. "Detective Chen," Tommy said respectfully, "if Dr. Sterling knew that Mrs. Calloway wasn't supposed to be taking care of children and she hired her anyway, doesn't that mean she put Hazel in danger on purpose?" The 11-year-old's question cut straight to the heart of the legal issue with the devastating logic that children often brought to adult complexities. Detective Chen nodded slowly, clearly impressed by Tommy's analytical thinking. "That's exactly what we're investigating, Tommy," she replied, "and it's a very serious crime to knowingly put a child in harm's way,
even if you're that child's parent. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Henley, who had come for her scheduled daily check-in but found herself walking into a police investigation that was redefining the entire situation. The social worker's expression shifted from bureaucratic routine to intense professional interest as Detective Chen briefed her on the evidence that had emerged. "Miss Henley," Detective Chen said, "I need you to understand that removing Hazel from Mr. Fowler's care at this point could potentially interfere with an ongoing criminal investigation. We may need her to remain in a stable environment where she feels safe enough to continue providing testimony." The reversal was dramatic and complete. Within 48 hours, the narrative had shifted from questions about Edmar's fitness as a caregiver to questions about Dr. Sterling's fitness as a mother and her potential criminal liability for child endangerment. But the most significant development came when Detective Chen's phone rang with a call from her partner, who had been investigating Mrs. Calloway's current whereabouts. The conversation was brief but intense, conducted in the kind of professional shorthand that police used when discussing active investigations. "Mr. Fowler," Detective Chen said when she ended the call, "Mrs. Calloway has been arrested at the Portland airport attempting to leave the state. She was carrying documents that suggest Dr. Sterling paid her a substantial sum of money to disappear and avoid any potential questioning about Hazel's abandonment." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Sterling hadn't just failed to prevent her daughter's abandonment, she had actively conspired to cover up the crime and eliminate witnesses who could testify about her negligent parenting practices. "What does this mean for Hazel?" Edmar asked, though he was afraid to hope that the evidence might finally shift the balance in favor of the child's actual welfare. "It means," Detective Chen said, with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice prevail against powerful opposition, "that Dr. Sterling is about to face criminal charges for child endangerment, conspiracy to interfere with a police investigation, and potentially accessory to child abandonment. Her attorney's demands for immediate custody are going to be put on hold indefinitely while we sort out whether she should be allowed unsupervised contact with Hazel at all." Miss Henley was already making notes on her tablet, clearly relieved to have evidence that supported what her professional instincts had been telling her about Hazel's placement. "Mr. Fowler," Miss Henley said, "I'm going to recommend that Hazel remain in your care pending resolution of the criminal investigation. The court will need to appoint a guardian ad litem to represent her interests, but given the evidence that's emerged, I don't anticipate any challenges to the current arrangement." For the first time in 48 hours, Edmar felt like he could breathe normally. The systematic attack on his character and fitness had been revealed for what it was, a desperate attempt by a guilty party to eliminate witnesses and control the narrative. But it was Hazel's response that provided the most profound validation of everything they had been fighting for. The little girl who had spent 4 years believing that she was unwanted and unloved looked up at Detective Chen with something approaching wonder in her eyes. "Does this mean I get to stay with Edmar and Tommy?" she asked with the careful hope of someone who had learned not to expect good things but was beginning to believe they might be possible. "It means," Detective Chen said gently, "that we're going to make sure you stay somewhere safe with people who care about you. And it means that your mommy is going to have to answer some very serious questions about how she's been taking care of you." As the detective and social worker prepared to leave, both laden with evidence and testimony that would fundamentally reshape the custody case, Edmar found himself marveling at how quickly truth could emerge when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances and professional reputations. The little girl who had whispered that her mommy and daddy didn't want her had inadvertently provided the key to exposing a pattern of systematic neglect that had been hidden behind charitable donations and medical accolades. Her simple, honest testimony about her daily life had revealed what investigative resources and legal expertise had missed, that wealth and professional success were no guarantee of moral character or parental fitness. The 48-hour reprieve had become something much more significant, a complete reversal of fortune that would ensure Hazel never again had to wonder whether the adults in her life actually wanted her around. For the first time in her young life, She was going to experience what it meant to be genuinely valued and protected by people who understood that a child's emotional well-being was more important than any professional obligation or career achievement. 6 months later, the Portland morning sun streamed through the windows of what was now officially Hazel's bedroom in the Riverside apartment. The small space had been transformed with soft yellow paint, child-sized furniture that Edmar had built himself, and bookshelves lined with stories that she and Tawny read together every evening. The tattered stuffed elephant still held a place of honor on her pillow, but it was now accompanied by a growing collection of toys and books that spoke to a childhood finally being allowed to unfold naturally. The legal proceedings had concluded with Dr. Vivian Sterling pleading guilty to multiple charges of child endangerment and conspiracy. Her medical license was suspended pending a full review by the state medical board, and her celebrated foundation had collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny and criminal investigations. The woman who had once been featured on magazine covers as a humanitarian hero was now facing potential prison time for the systematic neglect of her own daughter. But perhaps more importantly for Hazel's future, the court had terminated Dr. Sterling's parental rights entirely. The guardian ad litem appointed to represent Hazel's interests had recommended that she remain permanently with the Fowler family, recognizing that the emotional bonds formed over months of consistent care were more valuable than any biological connection to a mother who had proven incapable of basic parental responsibility. Edmar stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast while watching Hazel and Tommy work together on a science project about local bird migration patterns. At 4.5, Hazel had blossomed into a confident, curious child whose questions and observations rivaled those of children twice her age. The formal politeness and resigned acceptance that had characterized her speech when he first found her had been replaced by the natural enthusiasm and occasional stubbornness of a healthy preschooler. "Dad," Tommy called from the living room, where he was helping Hazel identify different species of birds through the window. "Hazel wants to know if we can build a birdhouse for the finches that visit our balcony." The request was so perfectly normal, so utterly typical of childhood interests and family projects, that Edmar felt a familiar surge of gratitude for how completely their lives had been transformed by one freezing November night. The little girl who had once whispered that nobody wanted her was now confidently making plans for the future and assuming that the adults in her life would support her interests and curiosities. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Edmar replied, joining them in the living room. "We could build it this weekend and maybe paint it whatever color you think the birds would like best." The adoption process had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, a legal formality that made official what had been emotionally true for months. Hazel was now Hazel Fowler, with all the rights and protections that came with being a cherished member of a family that valued her presence rather than viewing it as an inconvenience. The media attention surrounding Dr. Sterling's criminal trial had briefly thrust their family into an unwanted spotlight, but the coverage had ultimately reinforced the story's central message about the relationship between wealth and genuine care. Editorial writers had praised Edmar's actions while questioning how someone with Dr. Sterling's resources and professional obligations could have failed so completely at the most basic aspects of parenthood. Betty from Millie's Diner had become something of a grandmother figure to Hazel, teaching her to cook simple meals and providing the kind of intergenerational wisdom that enriched her understanding of how families could extend beyond biological relationships. Detective Chen checked in periodically, not in any official capacity, but as someone who had been moved by Hazel's courage in testifying against the adults who had failed her. Even Miss Hendley had remained in their lives, though her role had shifted from child protection investigator to family friend, who occasionally brought books and educational toys that she thought Hazel might enjoy. The social worker had been profoundly affected by how wrong the initial assessment of Edmar's fitness had been, and she had become an advocate for policy changes that would prioritize emotional welfare over economic status in custody decisions. Hazel, Edmar said as they planned their weekend birdhouse project, do you remember what you told me that first night when I asked you what would make you feel safe? The little girl considered the question with the thoughtful attention she brought to all important conversations. I asked if I could stay with you and Tommy, but I also promised I would be very good and not cause any trouble.
"And what do you think about that promise now?" Edmar asked gently. Hazel's face broke into the radiant smile that had become increasingly frequent over the past months. "I think I was silly," she said with the confidence of someone who had learned that love wasn't conditional on perfect behavior. "Tommy causes trouble sometimes, and you still love him. And you tell me that families help each other with problems instead of getting rid of people who have them." The wisdom in her response revealed how completely her understanding of relationships had been transformed. The 4-year-old who would once believed she needed to earn affection through invisible perfection now understood that real families were built on unconditional acceptance and mutual support. As they sat together planning their birdhouse project, Edmar reflected on how the past 6 months had challenged everything he thought he knew about justice, family, and the relationship between material success and moral character. Dr. Sterling's fall from grace had been swift and complete, but it had also revealed how easily society could mistake professional achievement for personal virtue. The simple act of stopping to help an abandoned child had led to the exposure of systematic abuse disguised as noble dedication. Hazel's whispered words about her parents not wanting her had unlocked a truth that investigative journalism and medical peer review had somehow missed, that caring for vulnerable populations in professional settings didn't guarantee compassion toward the vulnerable people in one's personal life. "You know what I learned from all this?" Tommy said as they sketched designs for their birdhouse project. "I learned that the most important kind of helping is the kind that nobody sees or gives you awards for, like reading bedtime stories and making sure someone feels safe when they're scared." The observation captured something essential about the values that had guided their family through the crisis and would continue to shape Hazel's understanding of what mattered in life. Real love was expressed through daily acts of attention and care, not through public gestures or professional accomplishments. Sometimes the most profound acts of courage come from ordinary people who simply refuse to walk past someone who needs help. The single father who found a little girl abandoned in freezing rain didn't set out to expose corruption or challenge powerful institutions. He just wanted to make sure a scared child felt safe and loved. But in choosing love over convenience, presence over prestige, and emotional truth over social expectations, Edmar Fowler had created something more valuable than any medical breakthrough or charitable foundation. He had given a discarded child the gift of belonging, and in doing so, had proven that the most sophisticated achievements in the world couldn't compare to the simple human wisdom of recognizing that every child deserves to be wanted, valued, and protected by people who understand that family is built on love rather than obligation. The birdhouse they would build together that weekend would become a symbol of what they had all learned: that creating something beautiful and functional required patience, attention to detail, and the understanding that the most important work is often the work of caring for those who need protection. And every morning, as they watched birds visit the house they had made together, Hazel would be reminded that she had finally found her way home to people who would never again let her wonder whether she was wanted.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.